Can you share with our viewers and listeners how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. So I was a public defender in New York. I started that job in about 2012. And then when COVID hit, I was one of the few people sort of in the left-leaning world who opposed the lockdowns and related mandates. I really thought that they were civil liberties violative. I also predicted that they would have negative impacts, mostly on the working class, the poor. Being a public defender in New York, like I saw the way a lot of poor people live. They have 8 people to a 1-bedroom apartment and one laptop, or if any. And I'm like, well, if these kids aren't going to be able to do school from home, that's for rich kids. So I was a huge opponent. I also started doing a lot of research into epidemiology because I had a lot of time on my hands since everything was shut down.
Yeah.
So, and I came across a lot of the scientists you're probably familiar with, like Martin Kulldorff, Jay Bhattacharya, Sunetra Gupta. And I became convinced this was a huge mistake pretty quickly, and just increasingly frustrated as people on the left wouldn't listen. So, I'd sort of try to talk to friends and family and say, like, well, I've been reading this stuff and they seem to suggest lockdowns aren't such a good idea. And maybe we should be looking at other approaches. Look at what Sweden's doing. And people weren't even willing to have a dialogue. It was just like, you want grandma to die and you're a terrible person and you're not willing to make sacrifices. And that's why you think this. And I got very frustrated, and I started to write for the American Institute of Economic Research, which was sort of one of the leading anti-lockdown voices in the country. They're actually anarcho-capitalist, so really quite far from me politically, but we agreed on this one issue. And in September of 2020, the editorial director, Jeffrey Tucker, invited me to a sort of get-together of like-minded people, including Kulldorff. And then a couple of weeks later invited me to come back. And that was when the Great Barrington Declaration sort of spontaneously was written. So I got to be there for that, which was fun.
That's wild.
Yeah. And then during this time, I created a Twitter account and it was anonymous for a long time. It was like Lefty Lockdown Skeptic was the name. And then at some few months later, I decided to just come out in my name. And then that was when people at work started to find what I was saying. They didn't like it, to say the least. And I decided, I was also just spending a lot of my free time working on this anti-lockdown stuff and trying to work a job. And I was like, it'd be great if my job was doing this anti-mandate stuff. So Jeffrey Tucker at AIER actually told me about this place, the New Civil Liberties Alliance. They'd been fighting lockdowns. So I applied, got the job, moved to DC from New York, and started doing anti-mandate litigation, vaccine mandate litigation, and slowly started to learn about how the government had been involved in censorship of so-called vaccine misinformation. And that led me to what I've been doing currently.
Well, that's the perfect story. I mean, like you were just mentioning, to get paid for this work, right? There were not that many attorneys such as yourself or myself or Robert Tyler, Scott Street, that were willing to do the work. I mean, number one, they were scared. Number two, this is really new territory.
Yeah.
Even though the Constitution has been around for a long time, we've never had national, nationwide lockdowns. This is truly unprecedented. And so I don't know if you experienced this, but when you decided to embark on this journey, were people telling you, like, you're never going to win, don't do it, do something else? Were people encouraging you or discouraging you?
It depends. It was dependent on where they came from. But yeah, I think a lot of people thought, even who agreed with me philosophically, thought we weren't going to win. And there was a concern, which to some extent has come to fruition, that in an emergency, courts are not going to be very willing to question the government, the other branches of government. And so then you kind of can end up creating bad law. And there's some extent to which that's true. Like, I think if we had challenged vaccine mandates now, we might have been able to win. But most of the cases where we challenged local or state mandates, we ended up losing because the courts were sort of fine. This was in the state's 10th Amendment police power.
Right. What's your... I can talk about that all day long, because as I mentioned, we litigate in the state courts and we try to focus on local control, hyper local control, because hopefully people understand by now, you number one, have the most impact in your local areas, whether it's on elected representatives and, you know, boards of supervisors, city councils, and then also you can vote them out, replace someone. And again, in that locality, you have more of a familiarity with the process, with the individuals involved, and then can hold them accountable without having to fly to DC, for example. But also, you know, and you're working in the federal courts, the state courts, like you said, they have that 10th Amendment power, but even separate and apart from that, the courts were unwilling, and they continue to be unwilling to take a hard line on these issues. We did writ petitions, which are very specific. We didn't even ask ever, you know, to end the local emergencies, for example. We just always asked the court to clarify or confirm our understanding of the law, of the black letter law. So we would do these writ petitions asking the courts for them to be honest and just read the code sections, for example, read the Constitution. Even we had a hard time with that. So we actually won, but then to get that final ruling, we've been mooted, as you know. You wrote an article about that, how courts are circumventing actually giving us final rulings that we can use in the future with this mootness doctrine. Have you been experiencing that in federal court as well?
Yeah. So for the second time, we had a case. No, sorry, the first one actually wasn't mooted. The court found it wasn't moot, but we lost this. So this was the first one. But there have been a lot of cases where that happens. So essentially, you know, the vaccine mandates being challenged or the mask mandate. And by the time, you know, the process is slow, you file the complaint, preliminary injunction motion. By the time you get a decision, it's 4 months. We've, you know, done away with the mask mandates. It's the summer. And then the court finds it's moot. The case is moot because it's not happening anymore. And then lo and behold, it's December. And we're going to bring back the mask mandate because you never got a ruling saying this is unconstitutional. So in this case, we had obtained a preliminary injunction against California's AB 28. That was the medical misinformation law that punished doctors for giving misinformation to patients about COVID. And misinformation was defined very broadly as anything that departs from the scientific consensus.
Wait, what was that? We didn't even know what that was because it was changing every day.
Exactly. And we won on that theory that it was vague. The court didn't actually address the First Amendment viewpoint discrimination concern. But so we got the preliminary injunction, but then another case had lost in the district court and went up on appeal to the Ninth Circuit. The panel was very hostile. And I think the government knew they were going to lose. And so the legislature repealed AB 2098, I think, to avoid creating bad precedent. So they argued in both cases that the case was moot, and the judges found in both cases that it was moot. So they didn't have to sort of reach a final ruling on the merits, which allows the government to dodge the